Okay, so get this. You want to understand the Nuremberg Trials. This is huge. We're talking about a major turning point in history and like a total game changer for international law. And lucky for us, we've got this treasure trove of original documents.
Oh, yeah.
Trial transcripts, agreements, even personal notes from back then, so we can really get into it.
It's heavy stuff, no doubt about it. I mean, we're dealing with the aftermath of World War II, crimes against humanity, so we'll approach it with the sensitivity it deserves for sure. But there are also these fascinating, kind of lesser-known details that I think really bring it to life.
Totally. So mission for this deep dive.
Right.
Let's figure out what these trials meant. Not just, for punishing the people who did it, but how it shaped how we deal with atrocities, even today.
It's 1945.
Okay.
Imagine that. The world is just starting to recover from the horrors of World War II.
Yeah.
And the Allied powers are faced with this, colossal question. How do you even hold the leaders of Nazi Germany accountable for what they did? I mean, where do you even begin?
Right. It's not like there was a precedent for this kind of thing.
Exactly. And that's where the Nuremberg Trials come in.
Okay.
This was the first international military tribunal ever, like a completely new approach to dealing with crimes of this magnitude.
And they chose Nuremberg for a reason, right? Like, it wasn't just a random city.
Oh, absolutely. Holding the trials in Nuremberg, Germany, the heart of the fallen Nazi regime, was incredibly symbolic. It sent a clear message: this is over, the Nazi ideology is done, and those responsible, well, they're going to be held accountable.
Okay, so we've got the setting, right?
Right.
We've got Nazi Germany, we've got Nuremberg. What about the players? Who exactly was on trial here?
Well, 24 high-ranking Nazi officials were indicted, including Hermann Goering, who was basically Hitler's right-hand man.
Wow.
They were facing these charges unlike anything the world had ever seen: crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity.
Crimes against humanity. I feel like we hear that phrase a lot these days, but back then that was totally revolutionary.
You're absolutely right. It was groundbreaking, to say the least. For the first time, individuals were being held accountable for atrocities committed against their own people. Not just actions in war, but systematic persecution, imprisonment, murder. It was a huge deal.
Wow, that's heavy. So how did they even begin to build a case for these new crimes? I mean, was there even a legal framework, a structure for something like this?
That's where the charter of the International Military Tribunal comes in.
Okay.
Think of it as the rule book for the trials, right? It laid out the legal basis for the entire thing, defined the crimes, set the rules of engagement, so to speak.
So the charter was like the foundation for this whole new system of international justice.
Exactly. It established that individuals, no matter how powerful, can be held responsible for their actions under international law. This was a radical departure from, how things were done in the past, where it was often only states, like countries, that were held accountable.
Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty of the trials themselves. What was it actually like inside that courtroom? I understand we have excerpts from the actual trial transcripts.
We do, and it's honestly chilling to hear these figures from history speaking in their own words.
Oh,
For example, there's testimony from Hermann Goering where he's, trying to defend his actions, saying he was just following orders.
I bet the prosecution had something to say about that.
No, absolutely. Their big argument was, hey, following orders, that's not a valid defense, especially when we're talking about acts this horrific.
Right.
They presented, mountains of evidence of the systematic planning and execution of these crimes. Documents, photographs, even eyewitness testimony from survivors.
It must have been incredibly difficult for those survivors to recount their experiences.
It was, and their bravery in doing so was, it was really instrumental in bringing those responsible to justice. The evidence was incredibly powerful, just showcasing the scale and the horror of what had happened.
So let's talk about those charges specifically. We kind of touched on them earlier, but can we break them down a little bit? What exactly did crimes against peace entail?
Sure. So this was all about holding individuals responsible for planning and waging wars of aggression. Basically, it criminalized the very act of starting a war without justification, something that was completely unheard of before Nuremberg.
It's like saying, hey, you can't just go around starting wars because you feel like it.
Exactly. It was about establishing accountability for the leaders who make those decisions. And it wasn't just about starting wars either. The war crimes charge that focused on violations of the laws and customs of war.
So even during a war, there are rules you have to follow.
Oh, absolutely. These rules are designed to protect civilians and just limit the brutality of war.
Okay.
Things like mistreating prisoners of war, intentionally targeting civilians, destroying city, all of that considered violations. The Nuremberg trials showed that even in the chaos of war, individuals would be held accountable for their actions.
And then there's, of course, the crimes against humanity charge, which feels especially relevant even today.
It does, doesn't it? This was about addressing atrocities committed against civilians, often within a country's own borders.
Right.
Persecution, enslavement, deportation, and murder based on race, religion, or political beliefs. The Nuremberg trials established that these acts were crimes against all of humanity, regardless of where they occurred.
So we've got the setting, we've got the players, we've got the charges. But who are the judges in this unprecedented trial? It couldn't have been an easy task to find people qualified and impartial enough to preside over something this significant, right?
You're absolutely right. The judges were representatives from the four allied powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France. This was a powerful symbol of international cooperation in the face of, unimaginable horror. It was really something to see.
It's almost like they were trying to show the world that, hey, even after a war that had divided them, they could come together and work together to achieve justice.
Exactly. It was a message of unity and a commitment to upholding international law no matter what. And of course, you had the legal teams on both sides, the prosecution and the defense.
I can only imagine the pressure on both sides. I mean, the prosecution had the weight of history on their shoulders, literally trying to secure justice for millions of victims. And the defense, well, they were tasked with defending the indefensible.
Yeah. The prosecutors, they worked tirelessly to gather evidence and build this case that would demonstrate the full extent of the crimes committed. The defense attorneys, well, as was their duty, they challenged the prosecution's case and represented their clients to the best of their ability, even in the face of, let's be honest, overwhelming evidence.
What I find fascinating is that, even though this was a completely new type of trial, they still emphasize the importance of a fair trial.
That's a really important point. Despite the horrific nature of the crimes being addressed, the Nuremberg trials adhered to these core principles of due process.
Yeah.
Defendants had the right to legal representation, to cross-examine witnesses, to present their own evidence. This was crucial in establishing legitimacy for the proceedings, ensuring that the trials weren't just about, vengeance. They were about justice.
It's amazing to think about the precedent that's set for international law. That's huge.
It was truly groundbreaking. The Nuremberg trials weren't just about punishing those responsible for the horrors of the Nazi regime. They were about building a framework for international justice that could be applied to future atrocities, no matter where they occurred.
This has been incredibly insightful, but I'm sure our listeners are eager to hear about some specific examples from the trials themselves. We have all these documents, right? Let's bring them to life. Let's hear those voices from the past.
Let's do it. So, welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about how groundbreaking the Nuremberg trials were. How they set this whole new standard for international justice.
Right. It's like they weren't just focused on the past, but they were really trying to create this blueprint for preventing these kinds of horrors from ever happening again.
Yeah, exactly. Before Nuremberg, the whole idea of holding individuals accountable for waging aggressive war or committing atrocities against civilians, that was, practically unheard of. It was this radical shift in thinking.
So let's dive into those specifics.
Mm-hmm.
What were some of the key legal precedents that were set by these trials? What mechanisms did they put in place for international justice going forward?
One of the biggest and most impactful was the affirmation of individual responsibility.
Okay.
The trials basically rejected that defense that high-ranking officials could simply say, oh, I was just following orders, and escape accountability. Right. It established that individuals, regardless of their position or rank, are responsible for their own actions, especially when we're talking about criminal acts.
That's a powerful statement, especially considering the context of blind obedience that was so prevalent in Nazi Germany at the time.
It was a turning point. It sent this message, that even heads of state, military leaders, anyone who gives orders can be held accountable for crimes under international law. No one is above the law.
Okay, so the trials ended, the verdicts were delivered, but how did this translate into tangible changes in the international legal landscape? Did those principles actually get put into practice?
They did, and in a big way. The Nuremberg Principles, as they came to be known, served as the bedrock for a whole new body of international law. They directly influenced the drafting of the Genocide Convention in 1948 and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, also in 1948. Both of those are landmark documents that, they enshrine these fundamental rights and protections for individuals all around the world.
Wow, so we're talking about foundational documents for human rights.
Oh, yeah.
It's amazing to see how these trials had, like, such a ripple effect.
It's truly remarkable, and it didn't stop there. The Nuremberg Trials also paved the way for the establishment of the International Criminal Court, or the ICC.
Okay, the ICC, I've definitely heard of that, but remind me, what is that exactly?
So the ICC is a permanent international court. It was established in 2002, and it has the power to investigate and prosecute individuals for the most serious crimes of international concern, so things like genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression.
So an idea that emerged from the ashes of World War II eventually led to a permanent body dedicated to international justice.
Exactly.
That's pretty powerful.
It speaks to the enduring legacy of Nuremberg. The trials didn't just punish those responsible for the horrors of the Nazi regime, but they set in motion this, process of legal and institutional development that continues to shape how we address atrocities today.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. We've been talking about the big picture, but these trials themselves were incredibly complex, right? I mean, I can't even imagine the logistical challenges of gathering evidence, navigating different legal systems, coordinating between multiple countries.
Absolutely. International legal proceedings are inherently complex, and Nuremberg was no exception. You had judges and prosecutors from different countries with different legal traditions, all trying to work together to address these crimes of, an unprecedented scale.
It seems like it would be so easy for things to fall apart, for disagreements to kind of derail the whole process.
It's really a testament to the commitment of everyone involved that they were able to achieve consensus and, actually deliver justice. They were determined to hold those responsible accountable, and they found a way to make it work despite the challenges.
We know there were criticisms of the trials, though, right? Some people argue that they were more about victor's justice than true impartiality.
Yeah, that's a valid point. One of the main criticisms was that, the Allied powers were essentially prosecuting individuals from the losing side of the war while choosing not to investigate or prosecute, alleged atrocities that were committed by their own forces.
So there's this question of whether the trials were truly about, universal justice, or if they were more about, just punishing the defeated enemy.
It's a complex issue. Proponents of the trials argued that they were primarily focused on addressing the crimes of the Nazi regime, which were, as we've discussed, of an unprecedented scale and horror. They also pointed out that the trials, they adhered to due process, right? They gave defendants the opportunity to defend themselves.
It seems like there's no easy answer, and it's a debate that that continues even today. How do you see the legacy of Nuremberg, evolving over time? Has its influence waned, as the events of World War II kind of fade further into the past?
I don't think so. Not at all. In fact, I think the principles that were established at Nuremberg are, if anything, more relevant than ever. I mean, we're still grappling with conflicts, genocide, ethnic cleansing, widespread human rights abuses, all over the world. The echoes of Nuremberg are, they're unmistakable in these situations.
So the trials serve as a kind of reminder, a guidepost for how we should respond to these kinds of atrocities.
More than just a reminder, they provide a framework for action.
Okay.
When we see these crimes against humanity unfolding, the Nuremberg trials, they remind us that we have a moral and a legal obligation to hold the perpetrators accountable, to seek justice for the victims, and to work towards preventing such horrors from ever happening again.
It sounds like the legacy of Nuremberg is really about ensuring that never again isn't just a slogan, but an actual reality.
That's the heart of it.
Yeah.
The Nuremberg trials, though rooted in this very specific historical context, offer, I think, these really timeless lessons about the pursuit of justice, about the importance of individual responsibility, and the need for this robust system of international law to address the most serious crimes.
This deep dive has been incredibly thought-provoking so far. We've covered a lot of ground, from the historical context of the trials to the specifics of the charges and the lasting impact on international law. But before we move on, I'd love to hear what has really stuck with you from those original documents. Is there a particular detail or story that you found particularly impactful?
You know, what I find fascinating is that, like, in those trial transcripts, right, amidst all the legal arguments and this, like, horrific evidence, you also get these glimpses of the human drama that was unfolding. There's this one passage where one of the defendants during cross-examination is confronted with this map showing the locations of the concentration camps.
Wow. That must have been a tense moment.
It was. He denies knowledge of their existence,
Yeah.
of the atrocities that were committed within their walls. But as the prosecutor starts pointing to each red dot on the map, each one representing a site of, unimaginable suffering, the defendant's denials, I mean, they just ring increasingly hollow.
You can almost, feel the weight of history bearing down on him in that moment.
It's a powerful reminder that no matter how high-ranking an official might be, no matter how much they try to distance themselves from the crimes that were committed, the truth has this way of emerging. And it underscores the importance of accountability. Those who commit such heinous acts must be held responsible for their actions.
It's a chilling thought, but an important one, right? We've got to face the reality of these crimes, head on, if we ever hope to prevent them from happening again.
Absolutely. And that's where we'll pick up after the break. We'll explore how the Nuremberg trials continue to shape discussions of international law, human rights, and the pursuit of justice in a world that's still grappling with conflict and atrocity.
We're back, and man, I'm still thinking about that moment with the defendant and the map of the concentration camps. It's just this chilling reminder that, denial doesn't erase the truth, and that the pursuit of justice, it's a powerful force.
It really is. The Nuremberg trials, I think they set this standard, this expectation that those who commit these kinds of atrocities, they're going to be held accountable. It was a declaration that the world wasn't going to just, turn a blind eye to these horrors.
Yeah, but as we've seen, international justice is complex. Right?
Oh, for sure.
It's not always easy to hold perpetrators accountable.
Mm.
So what are some of the challenges that we face in upholding those Nuremberg principles today? I mean, it's been decades, but we're still dealing with these issues.
Yeah, one of the biggest hurdles, I think, is this concept of state sovereignty.
Okay.
The idea that countries are ultimately in control of their own affairs, their own legal systems.
Mm.
And this can make it really tricky to investigate and prosecute crimes, even when they reach the level of crimes against humanity, if they're committed within a country's own borders.
So sometimes it's like a country can shield those responsible for these acts, even if they violate international law.
It can be a challenge. It's like this constant balancing act between respecting a country's autonomy and upholding these universal standards of justice. Yeah. And then there's the issue of enforcement. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, for example, it relies on cooperation from states, from different countries to, actually arrest and surrender suspects. But what happens when you have a powerful country that just refuses to cooperate?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It feels like we're constantly testing the limits of international law, trying to figure out how to make sure that justice is served, even when it's difficult.
We are. But that testing is essential.
Yeah.
Every time a perpetrator is actually brought to justice, every time we reaffirm those principles that were established in Nuremberg, I think we're strengthening that fabric of international law, right? And we're signaling that those crimes, they're not going to be tolerated.
Mm. And it's not just about courts and legal mechanisms, right? I mean, the Nuremberg trials, they kind of sparked this broader conversation about moral responsibility, about the role of individuals in preventing these kinds of atrocities.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in upholding human rights and speaking out against injustice and making sure that never again isn't just a slogan, but an actual lived reality.
It's like saying we can't just rely on institutions and legal frameworks to do the work for us.
Yeah.
We all have this personal responsibility to act, to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard.
That's the heart of it. The Nuremberg trials, I think, they gave us this framework for action, a set of principles to guide us in this ongoing fight against impunity. It showed us that even in the face of, unimaginable horror, humanity can prevail, but it takes courage, it takes persistence and a commitment to justice.
And that fight continues, I mean, we see it in the work of human rights organizations.
Yeah.
We see it in the efforts of individuals, governments, to document and prosecute these crimes against humanity. We see it in the everyday acts of courage by those who they stand up for what they believe is right, even when it's dangerous.
Exactly. It's this collective effort. We all have a part to play. The Nuremberg Trials, they showed us that justice at this international level, it requires cooperation, it requires persistence, and it requires a belief that even when things seem really bleak, we can build a better future.
So, what does this all mean for you, the listener? You've taken this deep dive with us into the Nuremberg Trials, right?
Yeah.
You've explored these documents, this historical context, the lasting impact of these pivotal events. So what stays with you? What are you going to take away from this?
What I find fascinating is that the Nuremberg Trials weren't just about, punishing those past crimes. They were about building a better future, a future where those who commit these kinds of atrocities, they're held accountable, and a future where human rights are protected for everyone. They set a precedent, the standard for justice that we're still striving for today.
This deep dive has only scratched the surface, really. I mean, there's so much more to explore, right? The individual stories of the defendants, the specifics of each charge, the legal arguments, the testimonies of survivors. It's this window into a dark chapter of history, but it's also this reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the possibility of achieving justice, even in the face of, well, unimaginable horrors.
So keep digging, keep asking those questions, and most importantly, keep the conversation going. This pursuit of justice, it's an ongoing process, and it's up to all of us to carry that torch forward.